Chapter 13 in the International Relations class is looking at international development, and there's quite a bit to talk about, so let's get right into it. First thing we'll talk about is what is the criteria for economic development, which we've touched on this a few times already. Here we'll be looking primarily from the point of view of what the developing countries need in order to succeed. Well, first and foremost, no surprise, effective government, a stable political system that doesn't enrich its members. We need human infrastructure. That primarily means an educated workforce. Less than half of all high school age youth in the low-income states are in school. Also need physical and technological infrastructure in communications, transportation, computers. And even though entrepreneurs and private firms may invent some of these things, it's the government that tries to ensure that this gets available to more and more people. Roads, communication networks, even availability of computers if that's what's going to help maximize the economy. Domestic order, again, a function of an effective, stable government, that if conflict is going to prevent development. Example of Liberia, 200,000 people were killed, civil war between 1980 and 2003. Economic diversification is another important criteria. If you have a dependency on one particular resource, such as oil, we've already talked about how that could hurt you in times of price downturns or corruption. If you have a limited agricultural capacity, then that could hurt you as far as economic development goes. We've already talked about limited reliance on primary products, particularly exporting of. The more dependent you are on those, the more poor you correlate to be. Market and investment access, opportunity to use the market or to invest in other opportunities. The poorest countries of the world, their share of the FDI rose from 8% in 1990 to 18% in 2010. That's a fairly significant increase in 10 years, and it hasn't increased a whole lot since then. But that is a pretty small percentage when you consider we're looking at the vast majority of countries in the world. And stable currencies, that exudes confidence in your political system if you have a stable currency. Looking at some data on economic growth, the South, which of course we're talking about the rich versus poor divide, North versus South, the South does now outpace the North in percent growth because they were smaller to begin with, so that's why the percent growth is going to be bigger. China, which was the biggest bulk of that, was operating at about 8 to 9% increase of GDP annually. Now that's slowed down a little bit, down to around 6 to 7%. The Asian tigers, which I've mentioned those a couple of times before, these are the states that have shown enormous success in plugging into the global capitalist system, such as South Korea in particular. These other examples here are closer to like city-states than they are actual countries, but they have figured out how to become major technological or financial exporters to the rich world, which then had them develop fairly dramatically. Here's the map of the real GDP growth from the International Monetary Fund. And as you can see, the biggest growers are the poor countries, of course, but they are still far behind in actual GDP. It's just that they had started off low, so therefore the percent increase is going to be more. And the United States has pretty much settled down into this 0 to 3% range, and under current conditions, it's more than likely that we will see a negative rate of growth over the next year perhaps. Looking at China in particular, which was the world's fastest economic grower over the past 2 decades, and also the foreign direct investment, because it was growing and lots of opportunities there for multinationals to invest in, stable political climate that let that happen and was conducive for that happening. So you can see the dramatic increase, 250 billion in foreign direct investment 2000 up to 2 trillion in 2010 and increased considerably since then. China has, oh yes, and of course China is the world's largest exporter in the world as far as making so many products that it can sell out to particularly to the rich world. Problems that they have to keep in mind is that there's growing class disparities. There's still a lot of people who are poor living in the rural areas that are in the process of making transitions. It's hard to say that all of these poor people could make the transition into more technological type jobs. With a very authoritarian system, the corruption always has to be looked at, particularly with the political oppression as well. If China remains authoritarian, could potentially see some unrest of its people if their economy starts to slow down. The people might not be as confident that they know what they're doing if the economy starts to slow down on them, and if there's no democracy or no elections, then they could be facing some interesting problems there. China requires a lot of oil imports. These are the main producers that China imports oil from: Saudi Arabia and Russia. No surprise there. Angola, around 11%. Iraq, about 9.5%. Iran it used to be higher, up around down to around 5%. Venezuela, 5.2%. China is exerting more control economically, and particularly with the South China Sea, which is a major transportation route for their exports and imports. China has somewhat assumed or claimed much of this as their own territory. So this red dotted line is what China has been, best we can estimate, assuming to be their territory, when in fact the UN Law of the Sea establishes a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. For example, this dotted line right here would represent Vietnam's 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which means that everything in this region would be property of Vietnam as far as what it would get out of that sea. But as you can see, China is overlapping in all of these territories here, and they're actually building some islands in perhaps to fortify defense capabilities in that region as well. So that's going to be increasingly controversial. The U.S. trade deficit with China, which we've talked about already, pretty substantial. You get 540 billion in imports for China, export 120 billion, so that's a pretty major trade deficit with China. The largest imports that U.S. gets from China: computers, cell phones, apparel, and footwear. As far as the largest exports that China gets from U.S., commercial aircraft, things like soybeans, automobiles. Taking a look at India, the biggest democracy in the world in terms of population, it's had an average growth since 1996 at about 7%. Has a democratic government, though it is somewhat fractious and has been dealing with corruption for quite a while, trying to get a handle on that. Its information and service sector contributes about 60% of GDP. So because it's an English-speaking country, that provides an opportunity for India to meet that information and service sector needs that the West could use them for. Progress a little bit slower than China, but without the authoritarian control. So we'll be checking to see how they grow in comparison. Looking at some other state experiments here, Brazil did make the transition from socialist to capitalist, but it's still having some difficulties in that transition, particularly with the corruption and then with the new administration leaning more nationalist. Nigeria is another example of where relying fairly heavily on one resource. Oil provides about 95% of their export earnings. They've also got some internal dealings with Boko Haram, the terrorist group, that could be disruptive. Israel, very strong ally of the United States. It gets quite a bit to sustained infusions of outside capital, and the state is quite strongly involved in its economy. Turkey, another ally of the United States. It was developed under the U.S. security umbrella of NATO, but they've been having their problems as well with a Muslim-leaning leadership that's been having problems with the Kurdish population, and their progress on entering the EU is pretty much stagnated. Egypt made the transition somewhat to democracy during the Arab Spring uprisings, but is still mired in poverty and gets substantial U.S. aid as well, and the democracy that it transitioned to is fairly shaky still because it underwent a military coup, and then their recent elections were somewhat suspect, so they still got some issues to deal with. This is what we call the emerging markets, the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That term BRICS may be kind of becoming outdated a little bit because there's other emerging markets that are coming out there. But these countries in particular are quite useful to look at because they have about 42% of the share of the entire world's population, and that share is increasing. And they only have about 20% share of the world's total GDP. So that's a lot of room for growth, and that's why if those countries stay politically stable as far as attractive investments, they would continue to grow. Let's look at a couple of approaches to development. Of course, the capitalist approach is still the predominant approach, but there's other ideas out there, and we'll just break these down into two major approaches, capitalist versus socialist. Capitalist is where we're looking at concentration of capital in order to spur investment. It doesn't matter where that concentration is. If there's a regional area in a poor country that is an attractive investment opportunity, they will build that up and try to generate wealth in that area, and then it would be up to the country to figure out how to spread that wealth. But the bottom line is they're delaying or deferring the equality or the equity requirements in order to try to get that spread out to as many people. They're going to delay that in order to maximize the efficiency to create that economic development and then figure that out later on. The unequal concentration of wealth is what tends to create faster growth. So that's kind of how the capitalism operates in the first place, because inequality is somewhat of a byproduct as well as a central feature of capitalism, because the opportunities are going to go where the market needs them to go, where that wealth can go the best. Looking at the socialist approach, the idea here is to improve the position of the population, particularly the poor, first. Try to get them educated, try to get them more plugged in to the system first, perhaps even owning property, to try to get them on even footing so that you have more equitable distribution of wealth and raise all incomes a little bit more equitably. And of course, that's going to require a lot of challenges and new ideas to try to do that, as to, are you going to use that investment into social goods, public goods first instead of private capital development. So that certainly could be an option to do that first to try to get everybody in a position to raise their incomes. Because the idea still holds up that inequality holds back growth by wasting human potential. Even in the United States, our inequality is growing and missing out on quite a bit of untapped human potential because of that. Looking a little bit more at foreign investment and what it is that attracts a foreign investment, FDI, to countries. The multinational corporations, of course, are the ones that are the drivers of this foreign direct investment. They're the ones that are looking for these opportunities to go to another country and invest and get a return on that investment. And no big shock there. Top of the list, political stability. They're looking for a country that has a developed infrastructure and a skilled workforce. They're looking for favorable regulatory environments. They're looking for a state that's got some amount of financial stability where the inflation rates are under control, the exchange rates of their currencies are stable, because that matters when you're doing business in that other country. You have to deal in their currencies, their interest rates, their inflation. Also looking at states that may have certain natural resources that would be conducive to their industry, as well as a cheap labor pool. China fit the bill on quite a bit of these, is why there's been so much investment into China and why they have grown so dramatically. Here's the map showing where most of the inflows go. Now, we've already talked about how the rich countries of the world get most of the inflows because they are already set up for that. But let's look at far as the rest of the world. Now, the countries in black here are what we call the OECD countries. We'll touch on them again here in a minute. But they are the 35 richest countries in the world, and this is where the overwhelming amount of foreign direct investment goes from these countries, no surprise, to the other countries. And when you look at the countries that are getting the bulk of this, these are the emerging markets that we talked about: Brazil, South Africa, China, India, and Russia, also near the top of that. So this is where the flows are going as far as from the rich countries to the rest of the world. More on foreign investment. The annual net inflow of foreign direct investment to the poorest countries, LDCs, grown over the past couple of decades from 20 billion to 240 billion, so that's a pretty significant growth. However, about 40% of that went exclusively to China because of their size, their opportunities, the way that they were structured to be ready to receive that. The poorest of the poor receive only 8% of the least developed countries total and 3% of all flows in the world. So this is where the big dilemma is. The countries that need this investment the most get very little of it, and it's because they are not stable enough, not attractive enough to get that investment. We've already touched on foreign portfolio investment. These are the stocks, bonds, liquidable investments, that loans that can go in and out of banks, and that is potentially volatile, that could be pulled out of a developing country if there's any types of scares or inconsistencies, whatever, and that could get pulled out and be destabilizing to the country. The OECD, which I've already introduced you to just shortly, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. 35 members, the richest states of the world, and the 8 richest states of the world. The G8 generates about 62% of the entire world's gross national product, so that shows you how disproportional the global capitalist structure is. The G8 does serve as somewhat of a forum for global public diplomacy, to where every now and then, whether it's the G8 summits, now they meet to spread it out a little bit. They meet as the G20 summits, and these are the economic leaders. They're at the direction of their country's leaders that are kind of mapping out the direction of the global capitalist system. So that's kind of how it works. And you could also argue that the critics of that would, particularly the anti-globalization critics, would say that, oh, well, this is kind of the shadow world government that's calling the shots, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And yes, maybe so, but that's kind of how it works. If the rich countries of the world get together and say, how can we work together? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, obviously, the rest of the world, if they want to play along, they have to kind of get plugged in to this system that is already here and doing fairly well for the rich countries. The problem, of course, is how the poor countries can get plugged into it. Lots of issues with the global south, poorest countries of the world, this technological transfer of information, patents and intellectual property. The multinational corporations would be it'd be perhaps benefit for them to share the knowledge with their host state, but that doesn't always happen. The multinationals, this, like I said, this is patented intellectual property, and multinationals lease that out or sell it in order to make money off of that technology. So it's a very controversial topic, because if you might argue that if multinationals didn't have the incentive to do these patents that could make them a lot of profit, well, then maybe there wouldn't be as much motivation to go out and try to create this stuff. But then again, if you had that shared out to where everybody's using it equally, then you would have considerable more opportunity for development spread out. The brain drain is what is referred to when the educated elites that are in poor countries, they go to the rich countries to get educated at the best schools, and then have a tendency to stay in the rich countries. So therefore, the poor countries not getting as much benefit out of that. There's quite a bit of debt. The South owes at least $4 trillion in foreign debt. That's loans from other countries and from international organizations. And in order to maintain their credibility, they have to pay the interest on that loans. This is what is called debt service. And that is a burden on our budget, on any budget. I just was talking on another class as far as looking at the annual budget, and about 12% of the U.S. federal budget is paying interest on its debt, and that's more than likely going to go up. That's about the fourth highest expense in federal government. And then if the states default on their loans, that could really hurt their credibility, hurt their future prospects. Might have to renegotiate that, go through some sort of bankruptcy type proceedings. And then there's also there's ideas out there of forgiving debt and starting over. Looking at more issues, particularly with the International Monetary Fund. That's the impossible mission for us, so that's not what we're talking about. But the IMF imposes conditions on the poor states in order to get this money. And this is what we call structural adjustment, to where the poor countries need to open up to free trade, privatize their major industries. So that's kind of getting it out of the socialist aspect right there. And that is somewhat controversial, because not every state might be geared or set up to do it this way. They may have to figure out how to do it with their cultural norms and then make that adjustment accordingly, rather than everybody having to fit the same boilerplate template here in order to get plugged in to this global capitalist system. So that IMF conditionality has been critiqued quite a bit. These reforms are required in order to get these low interest loans, and then the things that they may have to do in those countries, which might be austerity measures, which would be to cut back spending and raise taxes in order to try to get back on a footing to where they would be set up to get these loans. That's politically unpopular. When I talked about the BRICS, the emerging markets, they have created, particularly motivated by China, a new $100 billion development bank that is looking to be an alternative to the International Monetary Fund as far as being able to loan out development loans to developing countries without the same conditions that IMF would require. Some more issues with the South on trade. It's harder for the poor states to protect their infant industries. They don't have the resources to do that, but yet they need to export, and they have a hard time competing with the rich countries that are protecting their domestic industries. And this has been the biggest issue with the WTO. The poor states actually have somewhat of an advantage in producing agricultural and textiles because of the labor force is more geared toward that rather than technological goods, but they still have to compete with the United States and the EU that pay billions of dollars of subsidies to their agricultural industry so that their farmers would not be threatened by the poor country farmers. So this is a big issue with the WTO, and the last rounds, the negotiations that they had, the WTO negotiations literally fell apart over this issue. The rich states, as we've already talked about, have the comparative advantage in the manufactured goods. So the poor states' exports are shut out of foreign markets because of this advantage, and the least developed countries' exports are only 24% of the entire world's total of manufactured goods. When, as they start to develop, they would certainly want that to pick up dramatically in order to improve their economies. We've seen this one before. The poorest countries of the world typically still have to rely on primary product exports. These are the basic agricultural products and basic minerals and ores that are sent to the rich countries for them to develop those into commodities and other finished products and then sell back out to the rest of the country, perhaps even sell back to the poor countries. So when the poor countries can develop their industrial capacity, then they can use those primary products in creating their own capacity for exporting finished products and commodities. So they still have a ways to go in these areas that still rely, as I said before, a lot of this is subsistence farming, to where families are just farming what they're able to farm to live on day to day rather than putting it into industrial capacity to export. Foreign assistance is another controversial issue, particularly when you look from the United States point of view. The general public opinion of foreign aid is not very good. Overall, there's about a total of $130 billion in 2012, and 90% of that came from what we call Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, which is the richest states of the world, much like the OECD, where those states submit or send out the vast majority of foreign direct investment. Well, the rich states also provide the vast majority of foreign aid. Got two different types of foreign aid. Bilateral aid is directly from the rich state to the recipient government, and that is more politically attractive to states like the United States because that way they can kind of control where that goes. The target for bilateral aid is 0.7% of a state's gross national income. The United States is considerably lower than that. We'll look at a table here in a minute. Multilateral aid is where the states give their money to an IO. The biggest IOs would, of course, be the UN and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And those would then pool that and then send it out to other countries. That's why it's called multilateral aid. And this money is used to try to develop the technology, to develop the workforce, to work on capital concentration, to improve research in those countries. And a lot of that, even though there are dues that the rich states have to pay to be members of the IMF and the World Bank, UN, these groups also rely a lot on voluntary contributions to do a lot of these specific programs that might target something in a poor state that would help them develop. Now, when we look at the UN target at 0.7% here, the United States, as I've already mentioned, is pretty far down on this list. No surprise here, the Scandinavian countries are exceeding that target, but most states are below that target as far as foreign aid. And there's a lot of arguments on this that foreign aid, no matter how much you send to another country, it's not going to really do all that much good. And then there's other school of thought that says that if the rich countries got together and sent considerably more foreign aid, they could solve a lot of these problems. So it goes either way, and hard to determine right now where we are. But when we look at the actual amount sent, obviously the United States sends the most because we have the biggest economy in the world. But as far as percent of our GNI, we are fairly far down on the list there as far as the OECD, or in this case the DAC states that are sending the bulk of the foreign aid. The issues with foreign aid does not always address the causes of poverty. If that money is going from one state to another state's government, that state might decide to use it for something else, such as perhaps even building military weapons. It can also be used as leverage for political purposes. So if a rich state is wanting a poor state to help them in the war on terror, then they might dangle that foreign aid and says, okay, we'll give you this foreign aid if you comply with what we need you to do in this particular political agenda, geopolitical purpose. And we also see that if the rich state knows that that money might be used to make or to buy weapons, well, then they could actually give that to the poor state and say, okay, we're going to give you this aid, and we know you're going to use it to buy weapons with, so therefore we're going to require you to buy U.S.-made weapons. That's another thing that the rich state can do. That's another issue with it. Also, the idea that much of it is wasted, or that it falls into the hands of corrupt administrators, because going from the top down, it trickles down, and it may get weeded out through corruption. And the U.S., as I said, requires some certain things with its foreign aid program. Requires U.S. food, for example, to be shipped from the U.S. in U.S. vessels. So therefore, the foreign aid industry, so to speak, is also benefiting a lot of groups, interest groups, that are getting a slice of the pie from this foreign aid as well. Whereas on the other side, if the U.S. put those funds directly into the local economy to buy local food, not only it would save money, it could potentially help the local farmers by doing that. So as I said, the agribusiness industry, the shipping industries, and even the charities, that even if they're nonprofit, yes, they want to stay viable, they are using their lobbying power to get some of this benefit out of this U.S. Foreign aid amounts there. So those are some of the main issues with foreign aid that make it controversial. So now let's sum it up here and talk about the comparison between the economic internationalism direction and the economic nationalism type direction. That's kind of what we started off with back when we initiated the conversations on the economic development, is that there's two basic approaches, and there's overlaps, of course, but looking at the advantages of economic internationalism, or the neoliberalist approach, to where we're trying to build this global capitalist economy. Well, the general prosperity that as we see with this global internationalist approach, states do tend to benefit from it. Everybody does tend to see their economic development generally rise, despite the fact that, yes, it's still unequal. But the ideas of specialization and comparative advantage are being utilized here in this economic internationalist approach. There's less cost of protectionism when you do that. There's less tariffs, there's less subsidies. We're trying to develop the earth as a global market to where we can get the best product for the best price. We are spreading out the capital in more areas for development, which the poor states desperately need. Talking about globalization, I said they all tend to lead to some consensus here, is that the more internationally engaged we are with our economy, the more potential there is for peace and security, because states are becoming reliant on each other, interdependent upon each other. And it's less likely for you to go to war against somebody that you trade with or is investing in you or that you are interdependent with in your economy. And democracy has been, as I've said before, somewhat of a package deal with market systems. So as market systems spread around the globe, then the incentive for democratic systems would also be there as kind of a package deal. Now, with the pushback against democracy that we've talked about, and the fact that China remains authoritarian, Russia is increasingly authoritarian. We've already talked about Turkey and even Poland and Hungary, states that are pushing a little bit more authoritarian. Even United States moving a little bit more nationalism. Well, then that's going to be an interesting question as to whether or not democracy is going to be remaining compatible with an international economic pursuits. Now, looking at the incentives for economic nationalism, we will always have domestic priorities. As long as we have these sovereign states, there will always be first priorities. How are the jobs doing in our state? How do we handle the recession in our state? What is the possibility of a ripple effect from another country? How do we guard against that with respect to our own priorities? There's and of course, the Trump administration was a pretty big believer in this concept right here that free traders typically get taken advantage of. Nice guy free traders, such as the Trump administration, had been talking about how the United States had been not getting the good into these deals, and come in and make better deals, focusing on how we can benefit from these deals. So that is still a common refrain that's a pushback against the internationalist economy and leaning back more towards a nationalist economy. And you would still have the incentives for controlling your economy as far as national security goes. If we are still worried about our national security, well, then we're going to focus on those industries that promote our national security. We could also use our national economy as a domestic policy tool. And the thing that we want to perhaps also protect is our own social culture, our own way of life, our own environmental protection. And if multinationals are going out and being able to pick and choose where they want to operate and not be held to standards, well, then the multinationals could be exploiting the environment or exploiting safety, exploiting cheap labor, and that would also bring out a lot of criticism of that in order to try to avoid what we talked about as a race to the bottom in standards by letting some of those go in order to let multinationals come in to the poor countries and operate. But that is the summation there on the global economy. So we will get into what we're doing is jumping back to a previous chapter because I wanted to cover the economics together in one group, and then I'm going to go back for the last week of class and talk about the environment.